Is it possible to run over 80 miles a week and still be diabetic? Sadly, the answer is yes. Today we're going to talk about a South African scientist and an expert in sports nutrition named Tim Noakes. Tim is an interesting guy. He loved to run. You might say he was fanatical about it in his younger days, but as he got older, he found that with all of his running, he was gaining weight and was in fact pre-diabetic. His running got slower, his health deteriorated, and at last he became a full-scale diabetic, all while running over 80 miles or 140 kilometers every single week. Tim Noakes had believed, as most nutritionists, doctors, and sports nutritionists do, that the key to staying in peak shape for sports was to eat a high-carb, very low-fat diet, and he had practiced this nearly all of his adult life. In fact, he had written a popular book that encouraged athletes to carb load before major athletic competitions. But as he reached middle age, his own health was falling apart. He was overweight. His running ability was severely diminished. One day he saw an email in his inbox which was an ad for a low-carb diet book called The New Atkins for a New You. Normally, he would never have considered buying this book, but there was something that changed his mind about that, and which would soon change his life. Tim noticed the authors of the book were doctors and scientists whom he knew of and with whose research he was familiar: Dr. Eric Westman, Dr. Stephen Phinney, and Dr. Jeff Volek. Noakes respected these men as competent scientists and researchers, and he was intrigued enough to order the book. And when the book arrived and he started reading it through, he later declared, within 2 hours, I said, "Oh my gosh, I got it all wrong for 33 years." He not only repented of his former emphasis on carb loading, he publicly declared that he had been wrong, and he told people who owned his book to tear out the chapter about athletes eating a high-carb diet. Tim has gone on to become one of the leading voices in the low-carb movement. He speaks at various low-carb conventions, he writes books, and he's been a significant influencer for a keto lifestyle. Now, I've known the basics of Tim's story for quite some time, but it was only recently I heard about the book that turned him around, which was The New Atkins for a New You. And I was kind of surprised when I heard that was the book that made the change for him, because I'd read that book a few years back, and the truth is I was not overwhelmed by it. It's not that I disagreed with the major points of the book, but somehow it just didn't strike me as being life-changing. Of course, by the time I read that book, I was already firmly in the low-carb camp, so you cannot convert someone who is already converted. But I thought that for today's episode of Beat Diabetes, I'd share a little from this book and what it possibly was that transformed Tim Noakes from a carb gorger to a carb avoider after just a couple hours of reading. First, Noakes admits that one of the things about the book that made him a believer was the large number of studies and research that was quoted and referred to throughout the book. This book is not just someone preaching low carb with a loud voice and a forceful manner. These men who wrote the book are scientists and researchers, as well as doctors, and they back their convictions with study after study and trial after trial. For a scientist like Tim Noakes, he could not have helped but be impressed by this. If you look at the index at the back of the book, you find dozens of articles and studies listed. As I looked over the book recently, I realized that even though I had come to my own convictions as a result of reading Dr. Richard Bernstein, a few others, and then, of course, learning daily from Mike the Glucose Meter, these men who wrote this book were far more scholarly than I am. They were carefully studying the research, and yet they both came to very similar conclusions as I have. In this book, New Atkins for a New You, one of their major points, perhaps the major point, is that in order to achieve optimum health, lose weight, and reverse diabetes, we must switch from being carbohydrate burners to fat burners. In the introduction, we read, "The key to slimming down and enhancing your health is to train your body to burn more fat. And the way to do that quickly and effectively is by cutting back on sugars and other refined carbohydrates and allowing fat, including your own body fat, to become your primary source of energy. Your body is kind of like your car. It has to burn fuel in order to function. But while most of us drive cars that can only burn one fuel, our bodies can burn two different fuels, either carbs or fat. Now, if we eat a diet with lots of carbs and lots of fat, as most people do, your body will always choose to burn the carbs first and store the fat. Some people have suggested that this is proof that our bodies were made to run on carbs, but actually, it's quite the opposite. Our bodies burn carbs first because if they don't burn those carbs, the carbs will cause a condition of high glucose and high insulin, which is incredibly damaging. Your body is not dumb. It knows it must get rid of those carbs first. And if you're eating a lot of carbs, it will never get around to burning the fat because by the time it clears out all the carbs, well, it's time for your next snack or your next meal, and it has to go to work on a brand new batch of carbs. And as a result, you never manage to burn the fat, and the fat you've been ingesting gets stored on your arms, on your face, on your stomach, and worst of all, on your liver, pancreas, and other internal organs. And that, of course, is a recipe for diabetes. It's not going to happen overnight, of course. Most of us can manage to struggle through our 20s, 30s, and maybe 40s. But by the time we're in our 50s, we will probably have insulin resistance and eventually full-scale diabetes. Another statement in the book about this subject is this: eating lots of carbohydrates acts as a metabolic bully. It blocks your body from burning its own fat, just like a playground bully who keeps other kids from using the swings. So your body wants to burn the fat you're ingesting and keep you lean and mean. This is the healthy and the normal way of living. But you just keep on gorging on carbs, and your body's in a struggle to constantly keep up with all those carbs, and it can never get around to burning the fat, which instead gets stored. Kind of like a man whose lawn is growing and growing until it looks like a jungle with ugly weeds and knee-high grass. But because he has an enemy who's throwing rocks through his windows, he's so busy driving off his enemy and fixing his windows, his lawn gets neglected and gets worse day by day. The authors write, by changing the balance of fats, carbohydrates, and protein in your diet, you convert your body to burning primarily fat instead of constantly making it switch back and forth between carbs and fat. And then they make a point that is crystal clear to anyone who eats low-carb, high-fat, but most of our world still doesn't seem to get it. They write these words: eating fats doesn't make you fat, as long as you give your body permission to burn them. Place the blame where it belongs, overeating and over-responding to carbs. And herein, they say, lies the theme of this book. Another point they make, which in my mind is incontrovertible, is that the Atkins diet, or eating low-carb or keto, has a diuretic effect which begins to work in just a few days of seriously cutting down your carbs. And that perfectly aligns with all the testimonies that I've heard from people who tell me over and over again that they not only lowered their blood sugar by eating low carb, they also dramatically lowered their blood pressure. In fact, this happens so consistently, and I've seen it in my own life, that I would be surprised if someone could eat a low-carb diet for very long without having to either cut down on their blood pressure medications or eliminate them entirely. I've heard testimony after testimony of people who found their blood pressure normalized without ever thinking much about it. They were concerned about their blood sugar, and normal blood pressure came along as a bonus. The authors write, consuming carbohydrates makes you retain water, but shifting over to fat burning has a diuretic effect, meaning you'll excrete more salt along with fluid. And this is why low-carbers usually find they no longer have to worry about keeping their salt consumption low to help their blood pressure. Their low-carb diet does the job. Another point they strongly emphasize in this book, which is something I've emphasized for years, is that when someone who is seriously overweight or tremendously diabetic enters into a low-carb way of eating, they need to start with a phase 1 mode. They call it the induction phase. I just call it phase 1. But this is a drastic low-carb way of eating. Their idea is that you start with a really, really low-carb diet and quickly convert your body into a fat-burning machine. And then after you get your insulin levels and your glucose levels under control for a while, you can adjust and become slightly more moderate in your diet. Now, you can never go back to the standard high-carb diet, of course, but you can incorporate a few more of the healthier carbs into your diet as long as they do not cause excessive rises in your glucose levels or increase your weight. One startling statistic they quote relates to high fructose corn syrup. They write, "High fructose corn syrup has infiltrated our food supply. In 1970, on average, each year Americans consumed about half a pound of high fructose corn syrup. By 1997, annual consumption per person was a staggering 62.5 pounds. Wow! Is it any wonder that Americans and much of the world are fatter than ever, more diabetic than ever, and sicker than ever? High fructose corn syrup is everywhere these days, and it is killing us. We are poisoning ourselves and fattening our livers, soda by soda, and eating one sugary food after another. Ironically, many people justify gorging on sweet foods and candy and drinks with the notion that they don't eat so much fat. Sure, I may like my fruit juice and my rich desserts, but at least I don't eat that terrible meat and I stay away from that horrible saturated fat, they will say or think. The authors write this: "It is a combination of fat and a relatively high intake of carbohydrates, particularly refined ones, that can become a deadly recipe for obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and a host of other ills." Well, I think you can see that the information in the book is not really revolutionary for those of us who've been eating low-carb for some time and watch YouTube videos and read books by people like Dr. Bernstein, Dr. Brett Scher, Dr. Kent Berry, and a host of others, including me. If you've been following us, there's little in this book that will surprise you or that you would find revolutionary. But for Tim Noakes, the South African scientist and runner who logged over 80 miles running per week, this book, The New Atkins for a New You, was indeed revolutionary. And the most revolutionary idea that comes from people like Dr. Eric Westman, Dr. Stephen Finney, and Dr. Jeff Volek is this: we got it wrong, and we've been wrong for an entire generation. Our diabetes, our cardiovascular issues, our high blood pressure, and our obesity are not a result of eating too much saturated fat. They are a direct consequence of nearly our entire world overdosing and strongly promoting carbohydrates. Pretzels, donuts, sugary desserts, bread rolls, pasta, breakfast cereals, tortillas, chapatis, naan, burritos, sodas, fruit juice, and hundreds of other high-carb foods and drinks are unnatural, unhealthy, and disease-promoting. We are living in a perfect storm of metabolic disaster, and it will take a radical change of diet to correct our course. And sadly, there are still nutritionists, dietitians, and even doctors that do not get this. They go around, as they always have, blindly pushing carbohydrate-stuffed diets and declaring in pious voices that our big problem is saturated fat. If we could just trim the fat low enough, get it low and then lower still, all will be well. The answer that Tim Noakes and millions of others, including myself, would give is, been there, done that. It sounds good, but it does not work. Tim Noakes not only reversed his diabetes, but after switching to a low-carb diet, his running times improved significantly. He found out you don't have to carb load in order to perform well in athletics. But whether you're an athlete or not, the best thing you can do, apart from trusting God and praying, to improve your prospects for a long and healthy life are to cut your carbohydrates significantly and convert your diet to fats, proteins, and low-carb vegetables and salads with some berries thrown in here and there. Tim Noakes became a convert as a result of reading the Atkins book and as a result of realizing there was solid research and evidence behind the low-carb approach to diet and good health. This was not just a book by three fanatics who hated carbs and sugar. This was a book written by doctors who were also scientists and researchers. They didn't just get on a soapbox and shout with red faces, "We have to turn from our sinful high-carb ways." They presented the research. They laid out their argument point by point and study by study. Of course, there are still some of the old school low-fat gurus around who will point to their own favorite studies and research, but the greater evidence and the most carefully done research points to the superiority of the low-carb lifestyle. And to me, the ultimate key is that it works in my own life. When your A1C has dropped down into the normal range and your blood pressure has dropped down into the normal range and you're no longer overweight and your triglycerides have gone from high to normal and your energy is up and you feel better than you have in 20 years, well, you know you've just got to be doing something right. I want to encourage you to join Benedict and me in our home through our new podcast, Discover the Word with Den and Ben. While you drive in your car or while you walk or exercise at the gym, you can be learning the Bible through our low-key, user-friendly Bible studies. To get the information you need to listen to our Discover the Word with Den and Ben podcast, click on the link in the description.